Morning, friends. I have to tell you, it feels a little bit strange here right now, standing here where I normally stand on Sunday morning, and none of you are here. Unfortunately, that's just where we are right now. We have to do our part as much as we can as a church to protect our own, but also to protect our community because of the COVID-19 virus that is going around. We certainly don't want to add to that. Hopefully, we will be back together soon. I'm hopeful that by Easter, we will be able to gather once again as a congregation. If that's not possible, I'm looking at some possibilities that might allow us, if the weather permits, to do something outside where we can be spread out. I'll have to work on that, and I'll get more details to you about that as we go. Now, I've been sending emails out this week, and one of those emails from yesterday, or from Wednesday, was that giving you the gospel reading for today, and that's from John's Gospel, chapter 11. That's a gospel reading that comes around every 3 years in the lectionary cycle. It's an important story in the days leading up to Jesus' crucifixion and ultimately to Easter. And in order to understand why it's important for John, we have to understand a little bit about what John does in his book. In John's writing, that there are 8 discourses and 8 signs that John presents about Jesus in order to show the world that he is the Messiah. And the story about Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead is the 8th story in John's Gospel. And it is the one that leads most immediately to Jesus' arrest and ultimately to his crucifixion. And so it's an important story. Now, I've learned something about us as human beings, and you probably noticed it too, and that is we have a tendency to see what we want to see. That is to say, we don't ever look at something from a completely neutral standpoint. We always bring whatever baggage we have with us, whatever we do. We always look through a lens that has been chosen for us by our life experiences. And so we see things differently sometimes. And you know that. And so we don't ever look at things completely neutrally. Now, as we go through this story from John's Gospel, think about that and how the different people surrounding Jesus at this time saw things from a different perspective that led them to believe completely different things. Now, our story begins before chapter 11. It actually begins in chapter 10. Jesus has been in Jerusalem, and while he's there, he was teaching, and as part of that teaching, of course, he got questioned by the religious leaders in Jerusalem, and he made a claim. And that claim was that I and the Father are one, and those that the Father gives to me cannot be plucked out of my hand. I and the Father are one. And the religious leaders, the Pharisees, the scribes, perhaps even some of the Sadducees, believed that what Jesus spoke were blasphemous words. And so at that moment they sought to arrest him, and they intended to stone him. But Jesus was able to slip through the crowd and make his escape because he said his time had not yet come. Jesus went into a self-imposed exile. That's something most all of us can relate to right now. He went across from Jerusalem, across the Jordan River, into the Transjordan area. He didn't go back home to Galilee. He went into actually a foreign land. And there he was hiding out with the disciples. Now, obviously, some people knew where he was. Some of those closest to Jesus obviously knew. And word comes to him from Mary and Martha that their brother, Lazarus, has fallen ill, and they want Jesus to come. Now, of course, for Jesus to leave where he was and go back into Judea in order to see about Lazarus would most certainly lead to his arrest because times were not so good for him right then. Then a few days later, Jesus tells the disciples that Lazarus has died. And he tells them that we're going to have to get up and we're going to have to go because God is going to do a work of glory through me. And you're going to see what this is all about. And one of the disciples, Thomas, who we encounter a little bit later in John's Gospel, the doubter, Thomas said, yeah, we're going to get up and we're going to go and we're going to be dead like Lazarus. So he wasn't real thrilled about going because he knew what might be waiting for them in Judea, in Bethany, just outside of Jerusalem. So anyway, they make their way to the home of Lazarus. And soon as someone notices that they're coming, Lazarus' sister, Martha, comes out and says, Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. And Jesus told her that Lazarus would live again, and Martha said, I know he'll live again when the resurrection comes. And to that Jesus responded, I am the resurrection and I am life. And you know the story that he called Lazarus forth from the tomb. And Lazarus came forth after 4 days of being buried. People afraid that he was going to smell bad if they opened the tomb up. He walked out. He still had his grave clothes on. And Jesus told the clothes to unbind him and let him go. And Lazarus was restored to life. That's a fascinating story. And I want you to think for a few moments about the characters who were surrounding Jesus right then, before and after the event took place. Because immediately after Jesus had raised Lazarus, while most people were oohing and eyeing, some of them probably falling down, some of them probably weeping, some of them probably confused, not knowing what to do, those who were opposed to Jesus, the religious leaders, said, we've got to stop this guy. We've got to find a way to stop him. So think a few minutes about how the different people around Jesus right at that particular moment, the event, right before and right after, how they responded, the lens through which they saw the thing. First, there were the disciples. And Thomas probably was not alone in what he thought, that by leaving their hiding place in the Transjordan area and going back to Jerusalem or Judea, to Bethany, that would bring certain death. And that wasn't something they were too keen on. You may remember, it's important to remember, that the disciples, as close as they were to Jesus and as long as they traveled with him, they never got to a point where they understood what he was all about and what his mission was until after Easter. Then they could look back and see the things that pointed toward it. That they still believed that Jesus would assume the throne when he went into Jerusalem. Palm Sunday would have happened just a few days or a couple of weeks at the most after the raising of Lazarus, where Jesus went into the capital, riding on a donkey, a sign of a king who is coming, and the people gathered to praise him for doing that. So the disciples still had fixed in their mind that Jesus was going to become a political ruler. And they never saw anything different. And that's why they wanted to stay in hiding until things cooled down a bit and Jesus could enter safely back into Judea and continue his march toward Jerusalem in order to become king. To gain enough support, to gather enough people on his side so that those who were opposed to Jesus would cease to be a political force. And so going to Bethany to see Lazarus' family was not something that they thought was a good thing to do. And so I'm sure when they witnessed the event, like many times that they'd witnessed events in the past, or this certainly was, if you want to say it that way, a bigger miracle than others that Jesus had performed, they were shocked. They didn't understand it. They didn't know what to make of it. And the second, Martha, and also Mary, because she eventually comes out to Jesus and sort of points the finger of blame, they had seen Jesus do some pretty remarkable things. They had seen that exercise of divine power that sometimes he could bring into the world by healing people, by doing things that changed immediately the course of someone's life. And so they knew that Jesus, had he been there, could have kept Lazarus from dying. That they had no conception that anything other than Lazarus' death would be a result now, because they didn't believe that Jesus would be able to do that, because Lazarus would have to stay in the grave until the resurrection, which meant something very different to them than what it means to us as Christians. And so they love Jesus. They're his friends. Probably Lazarus, Mary, and Martha are the closest friends he has outside of that group of disciples, the 12. And no doubt they had been with Jesus many times when he did great things. They believed in him. They believed that he was the Messiah. They believed that he would usher in God's kingdom. But still, at that moment, all they could see, the lens through which they looked at the thing, was the grief over their dead brother. And so, like many people who grieve, many people who are hurting, they lashed out a little bit and said, Lord, if you had just been here, he wouldn't have died. Why didn't you come earlier when we told you he was sick? We got word to you in plenty of time. If you had left where you were right at that moment, you would have been here in time and Lazarus would not be dead. So in their grief, without really trying to blame Jesus for Lazarus' death, they ended up blaming Jesus for Lazarus' death. And Jesus had that discourse with Martha and said, I am the resurrection and life, and those who believe in me will never die. Those who believe in me, even though they die, yet will they live. What was Jesus saying? Jesus was saying that in himself, God is going to work this power of resurrection that will ultimately triumph over death itself, so that those who believe in Jesus will never die. Never, never, never. And I think the consequences of that are important, and we'll get to those in just a few moments. But the last group around Jesus at the time were those onlookers. And those onlookers included people who probably didn't have much of an opinion one way or another about Jesus, may not even really have known about him much. And then those religious leaders. And those who really didn't have a strong opinion about Jesus were flabbergasted. They'd never seen anything like this. Who has seen anything like that? And so they were in awe of him for at least a few moments. But not those who were religious leaders who had been opposed to Jesus. Now you may ask yourself the question, how in the world could those folks see what Jesus had done and still not believe, to still oppose him? Well, it's those lenses through which they saw the world. You see, they thought that they had God figured out. And that God was interested in people doing what he had previously commanded them to do, obeying the law, obeying the rituals, and anything that deviated from that was not from God, but from the devil. And so those religious leaders looked at what Jesus did, and they really truly thought that not only was he a blasphemer, not only was he one who brought division into the people of God, but that he actually was doing things that are evil. And only by some evil power could he manipulate the forces of nature and bring this man back to life. And so the different people who were around Jesus saw it differently. Now, John tells us this story for a reason. The first reason that he tells the story is because it leads up to what happens after that. Ultimately, that crowd that more or less despised Jesus won the day, or so they thought. Jesus was arrested, tried, sentenced, and crucified. And everyone, including the disciples, including Mary and Martha, even Jesus' own mother, Mary, would have thought that was finality. That even though Jesus was able to bring Lazarus back to life, there was no one to bring Jesus back to life. And it wasn't until after Easter that they were able to look back and see things that they missed before. Signs that pointed exactly where Jesus was trying to get them to look toward and see. But they couldn't, because the lens that they were looking at the world through had to be changed. And Easter changed that lens for each of them. The story is significant because Jesus not only demonstrates that he is from God, that he is God in flesh, but it's also a profound teaching moment. And that teaching moment is about Jesus being resurrection and life, so that those who believe in him do not have to worry about death, because the Spirit will never die. And when I think about that story, and I think about the time that we're in right now, a time unprecedented for most of us, though the world has known plagues many, many times in the past, none of us have really ever experienced anything like this. If you get out on the road and you have to go somewhere, you notice pretty quickly the traffic is very slim. We can't even open the doors of the church right now because of fear of that virus, and also trying to be responsible and not spread it around. Stores are closing. Restaurants are closing. And no one knows what the full impact is going to be yet. Is the economy going to be stifled to such a degree that something like a depression happens again? Will this virus continue to rage and rage and rage? And even though it hasn't got to that place yet in our own nation, there are places in the world where it's having a devastating effect. Italy, Spain, Iran. It's spreading like wildfire. And some people don't experience anything at all, and others grow deathly ill. And no one really understands why. And so a lot of us probably feel a bit uncertain right now. Feel that ground upon which we're used to standing is not quite as firm as we thought it was. That things aren't quite as permanent as we once would have believed. And that's the lens through which we have to look at the world right now. But we can also look through the lens of faith. When Jesus got back from the Transjordan area to Bethany and was greeted by Martha, she exclaimed, "If you had been here, why didn't you come? Why didn't you do something?" You know, I think that might be our temptation today too. Why doesn't God act? Why doesn't God stop it? Why doesn't God suddenly make things different? Or for that matter, why doesn't God go ahead and bring the kingdom in its fullness? Still others will look at this event of the day, and they'll see in it a sign that the end is near. You've seen the books, I'm sure, every time you go into a bookstore, or you've seen them advertised on television, that there are some pundits out there that look at most any event and find it to be a sign of the end times. And no doubt books will be written about this too. That there are others who might say that it's God's judgment. I've seen people say that. You probably have too. For some sin of some group of people, and it's God's punishment. The problem with that, of course, is that it's not just that supposed group that ends up getting punished, but everybody. And certainly, we wouldn't be able to say that the people of China are any better or morally superior to the people of Italy, and yet they're suffering even more than China did. And so the temptation might be, God, where are you? Are you hiding? Are you powerless? Can't you do anything? Won't you do anything? Don't you care? Is this God's wrath? Is this a sign of the end? And I think Jesus might give the same answer to us that he gave to Martha. Martha said, I know in the future that Lazarus will live again, but that's not going to help me right now. And Jesus said, no, he's going to live again today. He's going to live again because of the gift of life that I give to him. Because I am resurrection and I am life. And those who believe in me, even though they die, yet shall they live. And those who believe in me will never die. Now, what does that mean for you and for me? It means this, I think. In the most uncertain times, in times that are stressful and times that are difficult to live through, where we really can't yet see the other side, that's when we're called upon to exercise our faith even more. To believe, truly believe what we say we've put our faith in. And what that means is that we really need not be afraid of anything. We don't have to fear what's going to happen down the road. We don't have to fear what's going to happen to us as individuals, because we know in whom we've put our trust. And if you believe that Jesus has the power to defeat the ultimate enemy of humanity, that is death, if you believe that Jesus overcame and defeated death, then that means that every little death that is lesser than that ultimate one is also defeated. And even though the world has not yet come into the fullness of God's kingdom, we have, to a degree, in that we can put our faith in him. And therefore, we don't have to fear any of those little deaths that come from time to time, like this virus, like the economy, because we're never alone. And none of them have the power to defeat us, because Jesus has already overcome them. And we can too. Now here's the truth. You and I can choose the lens through which we look at the world. We can see the glass half empty or half full. Oh, I know that we're oriented one way or the other, it seems, but we have the power to overcome whatever is our normal pattern and do something different. We have the power to look through faith at the world. And whatever it is that is troubling us right now, our faith empowers us to not simply overcome it, but to gain victory over it. Because in Jesus we have resurrection and life, so that we never, 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 never have to die. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen.